You're listening to On the Margins with me, Dan O'Sullivan.
And me, Eamon Stack-Mulvihill.
In this podcast, we'll examine sites of education which are off the beaten track. Non-traditional, non-typical, but diverse and exceptional. Looking at learners who are often marginalised and ignored. We're delighted to have PJ McNamara here with us today, and he is the Home Education Assessor with TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, and formerly the National Coordinator of the Home Education Service. So, PJ, thank you very, very much for coming in to us here today. And I suppose we'll start with an easy one. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be in your current role?
Right, well, I suppose my background was in second level education. I taught for many years in doing CBS out in East Limerick, and then I was in management in the Rathkeil, and finally I was principal in Kilmallock for a number of years before I decided that I would like to look at alternatives, and the position came up in the what was that time known as the National Education Welfare Board of addressing the issue of people being homeschooled and how to put that on a more formal setting. At that time, there was quite a number of people who were applying to home educate their children, and there wasn't a legal response to it until you had the Education Welfare Act passed. And that gave the legal background to having the department assess the provision that people were making for their children in a home education setting. And I was appointed to the full-time role, the only person at that time who had that role of traversing the state and assessing the provision that people were making for their children. Okay,
and you mentioned Doom there. So you might know my former boss, because I was a teacher in Youth Reach in Capel White. And you may have come across a famous Tipperary hurler there, John Kelly. He was head of the Youth Reach in Capel White, where I worked for many years. Yeah. And as we kind of move subtly onto the subject of Youth Reach, I'm wondering, are people who want to engage in homeschooling, are they people who are sort of they don't want to be in school for a particular reason? Maybe there's bullying, maybe there's discrimination, maybe there's marginalisation. Or
well, I think first of all, just to refer back to John Kelly, I know John very, very well. We were very good friends. In actual fact, we were both past pupils of doing CBS. John was a little bit younger than me, and our lives crossed many, many times over many, many years. And I was very, very sad to hear of John's death there in the last couple of years. John made a major contribution, not just to education at second level in Capel White, but later on into the whole area of the alternative education around aspects like, for example, Youth Reach. Made a major contribution. To refer to your question, there can be a perception that home education kind of is confined to people from, say, marginalised background, or people who might, for example, be a little bit alternative in their lifestyles, and that's not the way it is at all. Home education spectrum runs across an entire spectrum, from people who are absolutely, completely and totally mainstream to those people who might be considered a little bit on the edges or margin of society. The vast, vast majority of people are mainstream people whose children may have started in education in mainstream settings. The spectrum can range from as wide as people with a very strong philosophical reason for educating their children. For example, they might have difficulty with their children attending either an over-emphasised Catholic school, for example, because they have a certain sort of belief, and maybe they come from Muslim communities or whatever. Or you might have people who were coming from various jurisdictions, like out of America, for example, or coming up from Australia, and they want to educate their child in their own particular curriculums because their stay in Ireland is going to be short-term. You can have people, for example, whose children have got an extraordinary talent. I'll give you maybe one example of somebody whose talent is quite extraordinary in music. And instead of trying to cope with that talent in a school setting, they will decide to cope with it in another way. In other words, to put the education around the talent rather than the talent around the education. If you could have visualised a child who might be practicing music for 50 or 60 hours a week, the difficulty of trying to deal with that child in a school setting. And that goes across the areas of the arts, it goes across the areas of unusual talent. Then you could have a situation where a child is way ahead in their own literacy and numeracy. They're way ahead. The child is well able to read and write at 6 and 7, and the child is finding it very, very difficult to cope with in a mainstream school. So the parents might decide for that 2 or 3 years to actually jump over the system. In other words, take the child out when the child is about maybe 8 or 9, and maybe return them into mainstream when they're 11 or 12. So it is very, very unusual to find a child who is on the spectrum of alternative. Very, very unusual. It can happen where the child can have a difficulty. And you do have recent and new sort of social phenomena. You have the whole phenomenon nowadays of school stress and school phobia, where children have medical conditions which doesn't allow them maybe to attend school. And the parents have worked very, very hard with the school to maybe address that, and eventually they find this isn't working. So we will now try this concept called homeschooling or home education. There is a difference in the two concepts, by the way. Some people have a huge difficulty around the word homeschooling because that suggests that it's kind of schooling, like repeating the experience of being at school. And they would be more interested in the concept of home education. The spectrum is very, very wide. And the spectrum, by the way, continues to change. The spectrum that I could list now may not be the spectrum next year. So the spectrum is changing all the time.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, PJ. Just before we go into the certain things that you look out for when you go into the likes of homeschool situations, you also spoke to me previously about another facet of your role where you visit independent schools. Would you mind talking to that just for a moment?
Yeah.
Then we can look deeper into what you look for within those schools.
I suppose just to give you the context there, in the Irish educational system, we have a number of different types of schools.
Yes.
They basically break down into 3. One are the schools which are entirely supported by the state. Those are the state schools, mostly of our primary schools, and the vast, vast majority of our secondary schools are state supported, which means that the state lays down the conditions and the rules, pays the staff, pays for the janitors, pays for the capitation, and so on. People are more or less familiar with that. There's a second tier of schools which are referred to as the private schools. Private schools is where the state also supports partly some of the staffing of the schools, but they do not give a capitation, and they don't give money towards the janitors or towards the secretaries. Those are the private schools. Good examples there would be Glenstall in County Limerick, or Villiers College in North Sartor Road in Limerick. There's a third group of schools that people are probably not very familiar with, and those are referred to as independent schools. Now, independent schools are schools where the state does not support financially. Those schools are entirely supported by the parents. Maybe the best known example that people will be familiar with would be Willow Park in Dublin. Willow Park in Dublin is an independent school, and that's a school which is funded entirely by the parents. That allows those schools to provide their own curriculum, their own learning experiences for the children. It allows those schools to employ the teachers as they see fit, and so on. Most of those independent schools actually do follow the Irish National School curriculum, because this is what most people are familiar with. There is a number that do not follow the Irish National School curriculum. They follow their own curriculum. Some of them are designed by themselves, or some of them are American-based curriculums. A good example are Christian-based curriculums. And a good example in Limerick would be the Christian School in Limerick. There is a Christian school in Limerick, and those schools are referred to as independent schools. They actually come under the remit of TUSLA. And it is TUSLA's legal remit to visit those schools and carry out the provision assessment there to see that they're meeting the requirements of the Act. And the requirements of the Act actually sounds very, very vague, that you must meet minimum requirements. And that allows both those schools and allows parents to adopt and use their own curriculums. You don't actually have to not to follow a prescribed curriculum. So Between the two groups, the home education groups, there's about 2,500 kids on our register there. And with independent schools, you have around 4,000 to 5,000 kids also being registered. So between both systems here, you have around 7,000 kids in the area of home education or the area of the independent schools. It sounds a large figure, but just put it in context of the overall student population of 1 million.
So if we go back there to maybe pockets of people, and just as we were doing the sound check there, we had a bit of German. Out in West Clare, there's kind of there's an enclave, I suppose, of German people, and I don't know why they picked West Clare in particular. Maybe it's because it's so beautiful, but there's lots of lovely German people out there, and they are they particularly attracted to homeschooling, or have they a philosophical kind of?
No. Again, I go back to what I've said early on. Most of the applications come in from what I would call mainstream people who have a reason to home educate at the present time. It could be the health reason or the philosophical reason or so on. You will get people from other jurisdictions here, and that is not unusual. I would have met people from so many jurisdictions who have come. Many of them are coming because they're also mainstream and they're coming here for work for a short time. So they come from maybe Germany or France or Australia, New Zealand, and they have a reason for being in Ireland, usually work related, for a year or two. And because the child is going back to their own community, they're going to follow their own curriculums, which is not unusual. That's what they do. That is taken to another level when you come across some of the schools or some of the experiences that are following, say, the baccalaureate program, the international baccalaureate program. The IB program is also quite common with some of those people because as you move between jurisdictions, you have a commonality of a curriculum. So that's not unusual. You will come across people who have come to Ireland for other reasons. And one, you mentioned Germany there for a moment. Yes, it is true. We do have some German families who have applied to come into Ireland. And they've applied to home educate because it is actually legal in Germany, and they've actually relocated to Ireland because the Irish constitution is so extraordinarily liberal around the home education that people have come from other jurisdictions. But that would be very, very minority. It would be only many single figures and not dozens or not even hundreds. But that is quite common to come across some of those. When you mentioned West Clare, you can also have the concept that some people think that maybe home education is again referring to people from certain minority communities or certain fringe communities, and again that would not be my experience. My experience is it's mostly coming from mainstream.
Okay. And I suppose in Germany the home education is illegal. There may be historical reasons for that. So maybe to move into a different area, and maybe, and I'm not suggesting that this happens, but let's say you had people who were particularly pious and religious, and they had sort of ultra-nationalistic views, and they're at home keeping their kids away from mainstream education, and so they can give them some sort of extreme, maybe a fascist ideology. And do you have a role in preventing that from happening?
Yeah, that's raised a very interesting question, Dan, and I think your point is so valid. In some jurisdictions, like in France, for example, you can actually home educate your child in France, but you must follow the French national curriculum, because in France, as in many other European countries, education is also seen not just providing literacy or numeracy, but is seen as a way of being socialized into society. So if you're living in France, you are expected to be socialized into French society, and you have to follow French societal values. And that's very important in that jurisdiction. And that applies right across the spectrum throughout the whole European Union. Ireland, with a number of other countries, is quite actually different from that. We, in our constitution, do allow for a lot more great diversity. We do allow people to provide their own learning experiences for the child, which means then that in any given situation you can have people following the Irish national curriculum with all of its liberal outlooks and all of its values around certain things of how you treat people and how you approach religion and so on. But you also can come across families who are being educated and being philosophized to a particular culture. My role is not to address that on behalf of the state, because the Irish Constitution is extraordinarily liberal on that. My role is to ensure that the child gets a meaningful education around the areas of literacy, numeracy, and the other areas of learning. We also have a role to play around the moral, social, and emotional. But our role is not to tell a parent or tell a family that you must follow a particular philosophy of life, whether you believe on people having a philosophical attitude towards a religion of either a left wing or a right wing or whatever culture you're coming from. Our role is literacy, numeracy, other areas of learning. Now, some parents can address that literacy and numeracy through the lens of a particular culture. My role is to go through that lens to see are the elements of numeracy and elements of literacy that allows the child to function in society. The maths can be taught in a particular way. I'll give you examples. Maths can be taught to various languages, right? So, for example, I would have families who could teach maths to German on a Monday, French on a Tuesday, or through maybe German or to Irish on a Wednesday. But through that, some of the families might say, well, we're teaching the maths to a particular textbook which very heavily based on maybe a particular Christian cult. I have to look through that and see, am I happy with the maths being taught there, that there is elements of multiplication and division, whatever lens you will bring it through. And that's basically our role. My role is not to say to the parents, I'm not that happy with your attitude towards, we'll say, evolution of history or the evolutionary theory. So if someone tells me that the size of the ark was X amount of leagues by X amount of leagues, as long as there's elements of numeracy there, it is not my role or the state's role to comment on the lens in which you're seeing it through. Again, just keep in mind, many mainstream schools also can see the learning through a certain lens, which sometimes we're not inclined to comment on. So again, remember, the Irish Constitution is very, very strong in how parents educate and home educate, or how they educate their children. Again, for example, we do allow in Ireland private schools to exist, and we do allow independent schools to exist. The Irish Constitution is very, very liberal.
I suppose it's an area that the Irish Constitution is liberal on, although the Irish Constitution historically wouldn't have been known for its liberalism. I wonder, are you familiar with Patrick Pearse's essay, The Murder Machine, in which he he berates the British education system in Ireland. Obviously, this is pre-1916, and he says to allow Irish children to be educated in their own culture, and you may as well expect them to arm us. I wonder, does the Irish education system being particularly liberal kind of arise from that, and the hedge schools, and the trying to preserve our culture when there was a dominant kind of colonial education system overarching the history of the state?
Well, I suppose, Dan, you're raising a lot of issues there. I suppose if we just separate it for a moment, just go back a teeny bit. The Constitution, which was the 1940s Constitution, never envisaged that large numbers of people would ever actually home educate. It was almost by default. Mm-hmm. It was to address the issue that we had two communities in Ireland, and have. That we had a nationalist community and we had the unionist community, and the Constitution was really sort of aimed in that direction. And through the cracks of that Constitution, you could argue through the cracks, the area of being able to homeschool your child actually emerged. It was never seen. There was no one sat down and said, oh, by the way, we've lots of people who are going to home educate. It wasn't in the concept. To go back a little bit to the whole Pearse thing, you've got to go back a little bit further than that and say, at one stage, if we go back to the early part of the 19th century, most people were actually being home educated. Mm-hmm. It was only in the introduction of the national school systems in the 1840s that you began to have the state involvement in large numbers of people being given the basic literacy and numeracy. You could argue a number of different ways about that. What was the whole purpose of that exercise? The whole purpose of the exercise was to prepare people to live in a more complex, industrialised community where you would now needed to be able to read in order to follow the manuals in the factory system, or being able to do the maths to follow some of the instructions in the factory system. And then that was a catalyst also then with the coming of the trains. The trains means you had to have timetables and people had to be able to read them and all of that. That's all was reflected in the curriculum that was being developed at that time. And that curriculum, of course, reflected, I suppose, being part of an imperial world, the world of the British Empire at that time. So you must look in the context of that. Pearce's point, and people that came in his time, was that the Irish had a unique culture, and that unique culture was not being reflected into that curriculum. For example, the whole study of the Irish was being discouraged, and people were not expected to be able to, learn through Irish because the imperial language is English. Not unusual if you go to other empires, whether it is Turkish of the 18th, 19th century or go to the Russian Empire, it's the same thing that happened there, where the minorities were submerged under the great big swart of the wider sort of literacy of either English or Russian or Turkish or whatever. Just go back again a little bit to the whole question of the Irish Constitution. The Irish Constitution does allow people to make decisions of how their child should be reared and how the child should sort of move into the complex society that we're now living in. Parents can decide to do that because the Constitution allows you to do that, and the Constitution does allow you to decide on what curriculum experience you're going to offer your child. We don't use the word curriculum when I talk about home education. We use the word learning experience, or we use the word areas of learning, because in many cases people do not talk about subjects at all. Subjects is a concept to do with schools. Homeschoolers do areas of learning because you can't sort of do timetables.
Okay. There's another issue you touched on there earlier before I went all political on you. And you were talking about a medical issue. So you could have, you could be physically too ill to go to school, which is one side of it. But then I suppose there's a lot of pressure on children now. There's a lot more anxiety, stress, school phobia, and kids are literally, they can be just too anxious to go outside the front door at times. Yeah. Is that something you're seeing a lot more of? Yeah,
I think that's a very good point. When I started first, there was two groups of people we came across very, very little of. One were those with special needs, for example. We saw very few of those coming forward, and we saw very few people coming forward whose children were expressing needs like school stress or school phobia. In the last 7 or 8 years, things have actually changed a little bit in that direction. Nowadays, we do get a lot more kids who are coming. Our parents with kids have a difficulty of attending school because of the school stress and the school phobia. It's a growing phenomenon. It's particularly true of the young girls, for example, who are now 13 and 14. Huge difficulties of attending school. The schools have worked very hard to try to address that. They reduced timetables, the putting together, the work that they're doing with them, the psychological services, the CAMS people and so on. And eventually the parents have finally reached a situation where the child is just not able to attend. They've gone through the area of school tuition where they get support from the state, and that hasn't worked. Now they're trying the final piece of the puzzle here in order to say, can they give the child some meaningful experience? The parents, they will work within themselves or within the wider community, because sometimes you must remember that it isn't just the parents here, it's sometimes the parents, they'll have the grandparents, they'll have some friends, some neighbours, they have a community of people who will actually work with that child to give the child a meaningful education, and it can be quite successful working through the areas of literacy and numeracy and also working through the health issues. Many of those youngsters really want to attend school, just can't deal with it. But many of them are very ambitious to go on to third level. Some actually do go on to third level afterwards. They can come back in and they can do a leaving cert, or they can do another documented program. It might be something like the A levels, for example, or the IB program, which can be done online. So that is not unusual. The other area of growth has been the whole area of the special needs. And again, many of the parents might find that they, in their opinion, feel they can offer a better education experience in the home setting rather than in the local school that might have, for example, an autistic unit or a special school. They feel that maybe the research that they have done with the appropriate authorities can show that they can offer a better experience because the child's maybe particular special needs is quite unique, and the child's special needs doesn't blend that well with the others in a unit in the school, and they find that maybe they can do a better job themselves at home. So that is not unusual. Those are two areas which I've seen quite substantial numbers that have come through in the last number of years, the areas of special needs and the areas of the school phobia or the school stress, which, by the way, are recognised conditions now. Schools are meeting that as well.
On that, it's great to see that I suppose parents can tailor the education to those students who either have SEN or if it's a stress-led issue. Is there any particular causes that have been identified as causes for the rise in this prevalence across schools, or is it a case of it just went undocumented, unidentified previous to now?
Can I jump in there before you answer, because I want to kind of jump on what Eamon is asking. And you said 13. You mentioned that as a specific age. There's a transition there from primary to secondary that's difficult.
Yeah.
It's a difficult age anyway. And also there's the prevalence of technology, which gives us a great ability to connect, but there's a paradox in it because it also can be very isolating. And I'm wondering, just to jump on top of Eamon's question, do you see that as part of the problem or part of the rise in school phobia, or maybe you don't have solid opinions on it?
I suppose sometimes when you're dealing with multiple questions, I
should have let you answer first.
I have to break it down a little bit. The area of IT. Okay, go back a little bit again. The area of the whole area of school stress and school phobia. Yes. There is, I think, some work being done now by people like Trinity and by the University of Limerick here that are suggesting that social media is particularly difficult for the young girls to manage. And yes, there are issues out there on social media where the children have a huge difficulty, and they're starting to withdraw because of the sort of negativity that's coming across there. As they're beginning to develop their body images at 12 and 13 and 14, there's great difficulties there with some of the kids, and they find it very, very difficult. In some cases, because surprisingly, the girls are so mature at 13, 14, they can't deal with some of the immaturities of their fellow colleagues in the school. So this is sometimes you'd meet
Sorry, did you, when you say that now, do you mean the boys?
No, the girls.
They can't deal with the immaturity the other girls.
The girls can be quite mature, some of them at 12, 13, and they are almost thinking third level, and many of their fellows in the school are still thinking more second level. So there can be a maturity there that finding it difficult to deal with the kids and the kind of conversations that they go on with there. But so yes, there are issues there around that. The issues of the technology in the home education has to split into a couple of things, I suppose. One is the learning experience you can follow online. Like we're getting used to that even in mainstream, where people now are using a lot of blended learning. And for example, we had the recent weather where we have our school closed for a week, and some of the schools immediately went online. I went into hybrid education straight away. There is an issue there which has to be addressed, which is the issue of isolation, and that's part of what we actually look for. When we go in to do an assessment, the big areas of learning are literacy and numeracy, and what's called the other areas of learning. The other areas of learning would be, if you have a child of 14 or 15, there's provision being made for the reading and writing, that's the literacy. There's provision being made for the maths, that's the area of numeracy. But we would also expect a wider areas of learning, that there would be some elements of maybe the histories, or the geographies, or the sciences, the music, the dance. There would be some provision being made there. And then you come to three other areas. That there's been some provision being made for the emotional development of the child. for the physical development of the child and for the moral development of the child. Some of those areas are easier to observe than others. For example, the physical development, you will ask such things as, are you involved in any sports, in any activities? What you're looking for there is trying to see that the child is getting a meaningful PE experience of some description. The child is not spending all day in the room or all day in the IT or all day being totally isolated. So you will find some parents work very hard on that one. They have the child attending the local football matches or the local soccer matches, or they're playing the local hurling matches and so on. So there is elements being made for there. The emotional one then is more difficult to define. In other words, like, how is the child dealing with their emotions? What's happening here? In other words, how are you going to see that the child is not being totally isolated, and how you're dealing with that original health problem. The original health problem might be something to do with something either psychiatric or psychological, and you're asking the parents how they're dealing with that. I'll come to a very important point in a moment about the conditions for registration. And then the one about the moral. The moral is basically, is the child given some sort of a moral compass that allows them to understand the difference between right and wrong, that they contribute to society as they go forward into the future, and they're not being integrated into a negativity around society. That's really, really important. When you go through the assessment process, you have to be satisfied that the parents are providing the minimum education in those areas. If I was to find that the parents are not providing that, well, then the parents cannot go onto the home education register, and the child actually has to go to school. The child actually has to get an education. If we find that when we carry out assessment that the parents are not able to provide that minimum education provision, well, then a number of things can happen. One is that we can actually recommend to the parents the following, say, conditions. We will be prepared to register you if you address the negativities in literacy or numeracy, or if you could address the negativities or the shortfalls in the emotional or social or physical. Then we would prepare to put you on the register, and we will return in 6 months or 3 months to see that this has happened. This gives parents an opportunity to address what were the deficiencies, or to address what we would now call the conditions. If the parents are not prepared, are not able to do that, or doesn't have the capacity to do that, well, then you'll find that they cannot actually we can't put the child on the register, and the child actually has to go to mainstream school. Mm-hmm. We do that, it happens. It's not that quite often, not that quite common, but we do have that particular role, which means that we are educationalists at the end of the day. All the people who work in my area now are all former teachers or present teachers. All of them have an education hat, and all of them have the authority to put you on the register or to take you off the register or not register you. Mm-hmm. That's extremely important. Home education or alternative education is a serious issue. You're asking, or the parents are telling you that instead of going to a mainstream school, we are going to home educate, and we are going to do the following. The child gets one chance here, and our role is to make sure that the child gets that opportunity. If you're not in a position to do that, and the position could be you yourself doing it, or with the wider community. And I can give you an example of what I mean by the wider community, where you have the uncles, the aunts, the cousins, the whole network of people. Maybe one example would be an assessment in Galway where 9 adults were involved in the homeschooling of a particular child.
9 adults were involved. Had they each a particular responsibility?
They were part of an interesting community, and yes, they were all there. There was grandparents, uncles and aunts, friends and neighbours, and they were all taking on the education of that particular child. That was where you had the role of 9:1, a bit unusual, right?
There's a lot of teachers out there who'd love that ratio, that you'd have more teachers than students.
If I maybe give another anecdote that might be of interest, a family in another county where they were home educating 14 children, and in all sorts of different rooms in the house with supports from the father and the mother and the older children. And I've heard some of the smaller primary schools saying that you can't have a teacher teaching any more than 10 children. And in this case, they were teaching, one parent was teaching 14 children. So the spectrum is so extraordinarily wide. It's everything. Just to go back a little bit to what people do, you can have people following an extraordinary commonality to the primary school. They've actually taken the complete scenario of a primary school and they've adapted it at home. For example, they have the classroom, they have the tables, they have the chairs, they have the whiteboard. The mum and dad actually put on the clothes of the teacher. The kids go out the front door, they come in the back door with the uniforms on.
And where did they get the teacher clothes from? Are they going robbing our lines?
You have an extraordinary formal setting.
Yeah.
And that's what it's referred to. It's completely formal, it's highly structured, there's a timetable up, same time every morning. You recreate it entirely to school conditions. That would be kind of a bit unusual, I suppose, but I have seen it. And then I have seen the alternative, which is called the unschooling philosophy. It's the philosophy developed by an American philosopher called John Holt way back in the 1950s. And that's where the education follows the sort of innate interest of a child. Mm-hmm. And you have, for example, the setting where you go into where the kids are out in the outdoors, like the forest schools, and they're running around and they're learning the maths from running and they're learning the maths from calculating the distance of the one tree to the other and that kind of thing, and they're learning all about the sciences and things. That's called the unschooling philosophy. And
that makes me think of Steiner schools. No, that's not exactly the same as homeschooling, is it? Because they are like it's a formal organisation. They do have curricula, but it's not quite mainstream schooling.
Yeah, I suppose if we're now sort of just touch off of what parents do, what parents or guardians do, or what people do in the home education setting. The spectrum there is very wide as well. The spectrum runs from highly formalised repetition exactly of the Irish maybe primary school or secondary school system, with a breakdown in subjects following the curriculum per se, right up to third year or fourth year, and once upon a time they could do it right up to Leaving Cert. That's becoming more difficult because of the project works and the requirements now. So the homeschooling people who are following the formalised curriculum tend to transfer their kids back to mainstream when you come to sort of around the 15 or 16, around the transition year group. There's another group of parents who have never followed a formalised curriculum, and they're the people who have designed their own curriculums. Their own curriculums could be semi-formal, or their own curriculums could be totally unstructured and varies from month to month or year to year. Within that continuous variation of their experiences, we always look for the basic elements of where is the literacy and where is the numeracy. And even where there's no textbooks, where there's very little written materials, our role is to go deep into that and for the parents to tell us where have they provided the numeracy for that 11-year-old, even in the context of unschooling. In other words, they don't have a textbook, they don't use much written materials, but you must find the elements of the literacy and the numeracy, which must reflect the age of the child. So, for example, on a given morning, I could have a 7-year-old, I could be assessing a 7-year-old's provision. In the afternoon, I could be assessing a 15-year-old's provision. Two entirely different contexts. One is where you have very basic literacy and numeracy, and the other then where you're asking the parents, well, show me where is the element of maths that you're dealing now with a 15-year-old, particularly when you have told me that the child is hoping to study engineering in the next couple of years. So if the child is going to be studying engineering, you must now tell me what elements of maths are you studying with that 15-year-old that's going to reflect that. I would not be satisfied that you're talking about basic single-figure addition here or basic single-figure takes away when you're dealing with a 15-year-old. What we're now looking at is completely different elements.
Okay. PJ, I have a couple of burning questions that I want to get through before we finish up, because your time is not unlimited. I'm going to kind of say this a bit bluntly, and apologies if it's insensitive. Is there a cost to homeschooling in terms of socialisation? And to put it rather unkindly, will the children be weird?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think I would like to answer that. First of all, I suppose there's a couple of ways of looking at it. One is that in mainstream, there's very few longitudinal studies of how people come through a certain school and how their lives develop afterwards. So you must look at that first of all. Second thing is that if we come to home education, it could be quite easily to take one or two families and say, they're doing certain things now because they were homeschooled. Ipso facto, this applies to all homeschooling families. My experience, and I've been 17 years doing this, is that the vast majority of homeschool families will eventually follow the same role or same path as people in the mainstream school settings. So I think you need to be very, very cautious of maybe looking at any particular family and saying because they were homeschooled, they're antisocial, or they have developed various attitudes which are totally outside of mainstream society. I think that the answer to that would be no. Most kids in the homeschooling session will actually become very valued members of the Irish society in the years to come. It is an alternative, and for many families, in my experience, it's a short-term alternative. Most families will eventually have their child in school in order to the Leaving Cert, because the Leaving Cert is the main route into third level. Some families don't follow that, but they might do an alternative like the British, for example, the A-levels, or do the International Baccalaureate programme, or do other ones which are recognised by the universities.
Okay. And what can the mainstream schooling system learn from homeschooling?
I think what you can learn is there's an alternative way of doing different things. In other words, some of the parents have come up with the most interesting ways to give their child the areas of learning which equips them for life. And some parents have a unique ability to see what a particular child's needs are and how to deal with that in a home setting. I think we're in a continuous change of evolution, and I do think that people that work in mainstream would be very, very wise to have a look at other alternatives. Underneath the Irish education system at the present time, there is a subculture of home education. And in that subculture of home education, you have people who are providing a really, really good areas of learning to their children. Our role is not to say whether this is the right thing or the wrong thing. Our role is to see that the kids are getting a meaningful education that strikes things like the literacy and the numeracy and the other areas of learning. But I do think that mainstream do have a lot to learn from people in alternative. And by the way, people in homeschool have a lot to learn from mainstream as well, because actually most of them, if not all of them, have come from mainstream.
I suppose on that, PJ, is there any specific pedagogies, methodologies, or any really quick things that teachers in mainstream education could implement in their practice that would maybe reflect what is done in homeschool and that is really effective at homeschool, but it doesn't seem to transition very well into homeschool at the moment?
Well, you see, they're two entirely different concepts,
yes.
Two entirely different experiences. One, you have a person in a classroom of 25, 30 kids across a great range of spectrums of ability, and that teacher is trying to do a commonality of experience there, try to teach maths to a class of 30 where there's 30 different people. And then in a home education setting, you have one parent dealing with one. So you can see the complete difference there straight away. I think what you need to look at is that even in mainstream, I do think you can look at every so often your own methodology in the classroom and see could you step outside it. Some people can do it because they do the leave of absence and that sort of thing. I suppose my own personal experience would be that I have learned in my lifetime some extraordinary experiences from this work that I've done. Now, I worked in mainstream in 3 different schools at either teacher level or at administration level. I've been working at this work for 17, 18 years. There isn't a single day or a single assessment that I haven't personally learned something. I've seen a different way of doing it, or seeing an alternate way of doing the maths, or seeing how parents are trying to cope with children who've got all kinds of difficulties. The difficulty could be that they are on the extraordinary genius side of the spectrum, or that they have kids with all kinds of special needs. You do have that extremism. You keep in mind that sometimes children have such an extraordinary talent that there is a difficulty with mainstream schools trying to deal with them. Having said that, some schools deal with it quite well. I think teachers must also always try to think outside of their own environment and outside the box. The difficulty in the Irish system is that when a teacher is appointed to any kind of a school, they tend to stay there. I think maybe in the years to come, or maybe the state should look at the possibility of a teacher being taken out after every 3 or 3 years, and even spending a month somewhere else, maybe in another school, maybe in another environment. I suppose I'll just give you one example. I used to have exchange programs with American schools, and the best teaching of biology I've ever seen was in an American school by one of the particular teachers there. It turned out to be he was a qualified doctor who couldn't deal with the medical world. He decided to go into teaching. He gave a lecture to the kids which was just mind-blowing. It just shows you that you do need to have greater experiences of life, and I think the greatest thing you can do is to go outside of your environment. We have some fine teachers in the Irish system, some wonderful people, but if you stay in the same school and in the same subject for many, many years, you can actually beginning to go into what I would call a little bit of a spiral.
Yeah. Institutionalisation.
Well, I would have said that I would have said that every teacher, if they could get an opportunity to see what I have seen, I've seen children being taught on the sides of the beaches in Galway. I've seen children being taught in the mainstream classrooms of houses down in West Cork. I've seen people playing pieces of classical music that would blow you away. I've seen people who have got the most extraordinary experiences. I've been into houses where children couldn't read or write at 15, and parents were telling me they were homeschooling. And that to me was an absolute tragedy. And that's why I think what has happened in the last couple of years, that we now have more people on the ground to carry out the provision, to carry out the assessments. So now we're capturing people who are just not in a position to homeschool. Homeschooling is not a place for people who think that this is an alternative of not giving an education. And education is an extraordinarily important thing to give any child. And if you're saying that you're homeschooling, and if the child is 15, and I've seen a child, and I've seen them, who couldn't read nor write, and they were on the normal spectrum, and parents were telling me, oh yes, we have homeschooled for the last 5 years. That to me was an absolute disaster, and it was a tragedy, and it shouldn't happen. Having said that, remember in mainstream there are people who are leaving who have difficulty with numeracy as well, numeracy and literacy.
PJ, your work, and you're 17 years at it now, both as the national coordinator for a home education service and as the home education assessor with TUSLA. Your work, I suppose, it accommodates a lot of people, both with special educational needs, kids who are gifted, and indeed kids who are sick, or they have perhaps a mental health difficulty. And it's accommodating diversity and also accommodating those who are coping. And you make a really good point about adapting to the environments and the conditions of the child, and we thank you for it.
Thank you. Well, it's been a good, interesting experience, and best of luck to you guys and your work and going forward into the future. And for people maybe to just think about there are alternatives of how to do things. 99.9% of kids in this community go into mainstream. Yeah. Just think of the figures. We only have 0.1%. But it is an interesting experience to have people have an alternative, and things can, there are different ways of doing it.
An rud is anna Sonntag.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Education on the Margins. If you enjoy and are learning from these podcasts, please follow us on all platforms. We'd also greatly appreciate an honest review of the podcast on any of our pod streaming platforms. This is the best way to support our pod. Thank you again for listening, and we look forward to providing even more insights, knowledge, and learning in the next one.